Imagine you are walking through a busy town square in the year 1450. The air is filled with the smell of wood smoke and the sound of horses. Usually, this is a place for trading salt, wool, and bread. But today, something is different. A massive crowd has gathered. They aren't here to buy or sell. They are standing in a circle, their eyes fixed on a wooden stage in the center of the plaza. On that stage sits a heavy wooden object. To a farmer, it might look like a piece of a broken wagon. To a merchant, it might look like a simple tool. But to the person standing next to the town's judge, it is the most terrifying sight in the world. It is a wheel. Not a wheel for a carriage, but a wheel that represents the final chapter of a person's life. Why would a simple circle of wood and iron strike so much fear into the hearts of thousands? What was it about this specific object that made it the ultimate symbol of the law for nearly 500 years? In our modern world, we think of justice as something that happens in a quiet room with lawyers and books. But in the Middle Ages, justice was a loud, public, and unforgettable event. The breaking wheel was not just a tool. It was a message. It was a story told in wood and stone that everyone, from the king to the poorest peasant, understood perfectly. But how did a common piece of farm equipment become the center of a legal system that ruled over Europe for centuries? The answer lies in a world very different from our own, a world where every crime was a challenge to the heavens themselves. To truly understand this history, we must first look at the machine itself. Known by many names, including the Catherine wheel or simply the wheel, it was a masterpiece of simple engineering. Usually, it was a large, heavy wooden wheel, often taken from a heavy cart or specially built for the town square. It featured thick wooden spokes and a rim often reinforced with iron bands to ensure it would not break under pressure. However, the wheel was only one half of the setup. It was usually mounted on a tall wooden pole or a large stone base. In some regions, the wheel would be laid flat on the ground with wooden blocks underneath it. In others, it was held upright. But no matter the design, its purpose was always the same: to act as a stage for the law. It was designed to hold a human being in a specific way, making them visible to everyone for miles around. But there is a mystery here. Why use a wheel? Why not a chair, a table, or a simple post? The circle has always been a powerful symbol in human history. It represents the cycle of life, the movement of the stars, and the idea of what goes around comes around. By using a wheel, the leaders of the time were tapping into a deep psychological feeling. They were saying that the law is a cycle that cannot be stopped. If you stepped outside the circle of the law, the wheel would be there to bring you back in. As we dig deeper, you will see that the design of the wheel was carefully chosen to make sure the prisoner could never truly hide from the public eye. Why did the people of the past feel the need to do this in front of everyone? Today, if someone breaks the law, they are taken away in a car and placed in a building with walls. We rarely see the process, but in the medieval era, secrecy was seen as a sign of weakness. If a king punished someone in private, the people might not believe it happened. Or worse, they might not be afraid of the consequences of their own actions. In a world without digital records, fingerprints, or security cameras, the only way to keep order was through deterrence. This is the idea that if you see something scary happen to someone else, you will be too afraid to try it yourself. The breaking wheel was the ultimate no trespassing sign. It was a visual reminder that the government was always watching. Furthermore, life in the Middle Ages was very community-focused. If one person committed a crime, like stealing or harming a neighbor, it wasn't just a problem for the victim. It was seen as a wound to the whole town. Public justice was a way for the town to heal. By gathering together to watch the law be enforced, the community felt that balance was being restored. It was a dark kind of glue that held society together. But was it really about justice? Or was it about something much more calculated? As we look at the process, you'll see how every single step was planned to maximize the impact on the people watching. The event did not start at the wheel. It usually began early in the morning with a long parade. The prisoner would be led through the narrow, cobbled streets. This was called the procession of shame. The goal was to make sure that every single person in the city saw the face of the individual who had broken the social contract. It was a slow walk, often accompanied by the ringing of bells and the chanting of prayers. Once the procession reached the square, the official ceremony would begin. A judge or a high-ranking official would stand up and read the list of crimes. They wanted the crowd to understand exactly why this was happening. After the reading of the crimes, the prisoner was placed upon the wheel. Their limbs were often threaded through the spokes of the wheel or tied to the outer rim. The executioner, a man who was often feared and lived outside the town limits, would then use a heavy tool, usually a wooden club or an iron bar. He would strike the prisoner in specific places. The goal was not to end the person's life quickly. In fact, it was the opposite. The law required that the prisoner remain alive and conscious for as long as possible. The breaking part of the wheel referred to the carefully placed strikes that disabled the prisoner without causing immediate death. Once the process was finished, the wheel was often raised high into the air on a pole. The person was left there, under the sun and the rain, as a living statue of the law's power. It was a scene that stayed in the minds of the viewers for the rest of their lives. You might be wondering, what kind of people would stand and watch this? We might think they were cold or cruel, but history tells us they were just like us. For a medieval peasant, a public execution was one of the few times they would see the high officials of the state in person. It was a day off from hard work in the fields. It was an event where news was shared and gossip was traded. But there was also a religious element. Many people believed that by being present, they were helping the prisoner. They would pray for the person's soul. They believed that by enduring the wheel, the prisoner was paying for their sins on earth so they wouldn't have to pay for them in the afterlife. However, there was also a darker side to the crowd's interest. It was a form of emotional release. In a life that was often short, hard, and full of illness, seeing someone else face the ultimate punishment made people feel a strange sense of relief that it wasn't them. It made the world feel organized. If there was a clear punishment for a crime, it meant the world had rules. And in a world that often felt chaotic, rules were a comfort even if those rules were enforced with a heavy wooden wheel. But as time went on, the crowd began to change. They started to see something in the eyes of the prisoners that made them question the whole system. When the wheel was lifted high onto the pole, it became a landmark of fear. In some parts of Europe, these wheels were placed at the entrances to the city or along the main roads. Imagine being a traveler arriving at a new town and seeing several wheels silhouetted against the sunset. You wouldn't need a sign to tell you to follow the rules of that city. This was the true power of the breaking wheel. It lasted long after the executioner went home. The prisoner might stay on that wheel for days. During that time, they were a constant reminder of the state's reach. It was a way of saying that the king's law didn't stop at the palace walls. It extended to every bone and every breath of every subject. Psychologically, this created a culture of surveillance. People felt they were being watched by the very objects in the landscape. The wheel was like a silent guard that never slept and never took a bribe. It was the ultimate psychological weapon. It wasn't just about the physical act. It was about the memory of the act. The leaders knew that fear is a much cheaper way to control a population than hiring thousands of soldiers. But what happens when the people you are trying to scare start to feel sorry for the person on the wheel? One of the most famous stories associated with this method isn't about a criminal at all, but a saint. Saint Catherine of Alexandria was a young scholar in the 4th century. According to the story, she was sentenced to the wheel because of her beliefs. However, when she touched the wheel, it miraculously shattered. This is why the device is often called the Catherine wheel today. It's also why you see Catherine wheel fireworks on holidays. They spin and throw sparks just like the legend. In later history, people like Jean Calas in 18th century France became famous for their time on the wheel. Calas was a merchant who many believed was innocent. His case became a viral story of the time. Famous writers like Voltaire took up his cause, arguing that the wheel was a sign of a society that had lost its way. These famous cases were the cracks in the foundation of medieval justice. When the public started to see the villain as a victim, the power of the wheel began to fade. As we entered the 1800s, the Age of Enlightenment changed everything. People started to believe in human rights and the idea that even a criminal deserved some level of dignity. New ideas about the social contract suggested that the government's job was to protect people, not just terrify them. Lawmakers began to realize that public executions were actually making people more violent, not less. Instead of learning to be good citizens, the crowds were becoming hardened. In 1827, Prussia officially ended the use of the wheel. Other countries followed quickly. The heavy wooden wheels were taken down, chopped up for firewood, or locked away in museums. The world was moving toward a new kind of justice, one that happened behind closed doors, in prisons designed to reform the mind rather than break the body. The era of the landmark of fear was over. Looking back at the breaking wheel, it is easy to feel that we are much more civilized today. And in many ways, we are. We no longer gather in squares to watch the law take such a physical form. But the story of the wheel tells us something deep about ourselves. It shows us that every society tries to find a balance between order and mercy, between power and justice. The wheel was a tool of a time that valued the group over the individual. Today, we value the individual over the group, but we still use fear to keep order in different ways. The breaking wheel is a reminder of how much our ideas of right and wrong can change over 500 years. It asks us a difficult question. What are we doing today that people 500 years in the future will look back on with shock? If you enjoy learning about the hidden corners of history and how they shaped our modern world, please subscribe for more stories. The past is full of lessons, if we are brave enough to look at them.